Hello and welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. Now, this is the first episode that is coming out since I released the big magnum opus of the year, my Communist Party USA video. The one that will probably remain the largest party history video for at least a good while, because I honestly can't think of any other political party that can be as large as that one. Well, at least for the minor party sphere, because, again, there could be a long cavalcade of stories for... If I used the format that I use for this series, I would definitely make a very long one for, like, say, the Republican or Democratic parties. But, of course, those ones are not going to be covered. I won't be able to top that one, but hopefully it will be able to top all my others in views, because if I've been playing my cards right, views will be going up a lot. Especially since I did check, like, in its first 2 days, it did really well. I guess, at least compared to other party history videos for, like, a day. Like, I don't think the Socialist Party got that many views in, like, a day. It took, like, a couple of months, at least, to get, like, a decent amount of views. But, of course, we'll have to wait and see. With that out of the way, let's get right into the news. The first news story is a half continuation of something that happened last week. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was almost assassinated. For those who don't remember, let me give you a brief summary. Cristina Kirchner was the wife of former Argentinian President Néstor Kirchner. He and her were basically what led to a left-wing resurgence in Argentina after Néstor Kirchner, won his presidency. But then, instead of seeking a second term, he decided to let his wife run for president instead, and supposedly the theory was that he and her would essentially swap positions, because according to Argentina, at least at the time, you could only run for 2 terms. So the idea would be like Néstor runs 1 term, Cristina runs the next term, then Néstor, then Cristina, and they would basically be in power for a while in order to keep their left-wing movement alive, which is the exact opposite that Néstor had in mind, at least for himself, because he died. So Cristina basically decided to keep the Kirchnerist movement alive, and what they did was actually very notable, because they turned a basically borderline fascist party into a borderline socialist party. It was quite the endeavor, and maybe when I inevitably talk about the Perons, you'll see what I mean. Like, if you do any research on Juan Perón, you'll understand what I mean. But basically, Cristina Kirchner has remained relatively popular in Argentina, even though her party has kind of waned in popularity. Like, ever since she wasn't allowed to run for re-election for a 3rd term, her party sort of went in the ground, and then a guy by the name of Alberto Fernández took up the mantle to try and reclaim the party, and he did so by having Cristina Kirchner be his running mate. And their win was sort of seen as like the potential success of like a pink tide 3, or like a pink tide 2, depending on your interpretation of the pink tide. If you know me, you know that I divide the pink tide into 3 groups. Meanwhile, most people sort of identify it into 2 groups. And even then, they sort of like weirdly draw a weird new, or maybe they consider this newest batch to be a 3rd group. But I consider, like, if I were to use Argentina itself as an example, Néstor would be wave 1, Cristina would be wave 2, and the current Argentinian president, Alberto Fernández, would be wave 3. But here's a huge problem. Alberto Fernández is not that popular in Argentina right now. In fact, he has a very abysmal approval rating. Fernández is fine, but the problem is, like, he's just not that popular. As such, many people in his party are turning to any other person to potentially lead the charge, and one of the names that's cropped up is Cristina. I would assume that since she's being propped up, that means she can run for re-election, or maybe it's like a thing where it's like, technically she can't, but who's gonna stop her? And what ended up happening is that due to this fact, it seems that a bunch of old charges during her presidency have been propped up again to try and push her to be basically the next Lula. And lo and behold, a fascist guy basically decided to try and assassinate her in front of everybody. Again, very much in the depth of like, oh, she will be a contender in the 2023 election. And a lot of people have, of course, made their opinions known about this. But the thing is, like, one thing that I've stated before, I stated the last time, that I think I'll state again, it's like, yeah, this is kind of a detriment to the Latin American left. Like, the fact that Cristina Kirchner is the one person who can save them is kind of a problem. Like, if this assassin was successful, then the Argentinian left could have kissed 2023 goodbye, because, again, Cristina is literally their only hope. If you look at the polls that have been done, Cristina is the only leftist that even makes it into, like, the top 4. And the fact that the Argentinian left literally has to rely on Cristina Kirchner, who, broadly speaking, like, was fine, but, I mean, compared to a lot of other members of the Pink Tide, she's mid-tier. Like, she was, like, above average tier, like a B tier. Like, she's no Lula Morales or Chavez, but she's definitely in there. Like, she's definitely not that far away from them, but she's just not them. But this does show that she is definitely worth paying attention to, because people seem to be scared of the idea of her coming back to power. And given her record, I'd say that's a good sign. And the people that she's making mad. Anyways, now let's move on to another piece of foreign news. The Green Party of Canada, they have officially revealed their leadership candidates. For those who don't remember, the Canadian Green Party has basically went from a rising star to a crashing meteor in like 2 minutes. They were a party that was basically considered a political sideshow in Canada, but then somehow they managed to start actually pulling in major successes. Like, basically, like, the Canadian Green Party was started, like, basically in the midst of, like, the green wave of, like, the late 80s, early 90s. And then, like, one day, randomly, they managed to win a random election in, I don't know which constituency, but it was, like, the one where their first and only leader, not first and only leader anymore, but, like, first leader, Elizabeth May, won. And basically, she remained, like, Canadians' weird sideshow. Like, she kept getting invited into leadership debates, even though logistically she had no chance of winning. Every election was basically heralded in Canada, like, is this the election where the Greens managed to do something big? But again, the Green Party, they just didn't really do much. But then, one day, they randomly won a by-election with Paul Manley, and then they won another by-election with, I don't remember her name, but, like, they won 2 people, and then that's when Elizabeth May decided to resign as leader of the Green Party, realizing this is as good as it's gonna get, so I'm on my way out. So then a contentious leadership election was held, where the main question of the Canadian Green Party would finally be answered. Like, basically, for the entirety of its lifestyle, it was this weird hodgepodge of people who were defectors from both the Liberal Party and the NDP. But the question was, they didn't necessarily know which party they wanted to line up closer to, because if they lined too close to one, they would have to alienate the other. Like, if you're leaving the NDP, there's a good chance you're not going to be going to the Liberals, so if a party is basically just like the Liberals, you're not really going to be going to them, or vice versa. And they had 2 people who were basically running with the answers to those questions. Dimitri Lascaris, who was running as an eco-socialist, basically saying that they would want to copy the NDP, and then there was Annamie Paul, who basically said they wanted to copy the Liberals, and somehow Annamie Paul managed to win. And then Annamie Paul, every single thing that she did as leader of the Green Party was absolutely atrocious. Under her leadership, she failed to win an election for herself twice. She essentially forced one of her MPs to quit, had the other one lose an election, and only managed to gain 1 more person, but due to an extremely oddball circumstance that could very much potentially be lost in the next election cycle. So unsurprisingly, Annamie Paul decided she was going to resign as Green Party leader because she's essentially driven the party into a further hole than it was before. And as such, there was a new leadership election that had to be held. And basically, the only reason I'm talking about it is because of one name. Here are the 6 people running to be leader of the Green Party: Sarah Gabriel Barron, Simon Ganache Messier, Chat Walcott, Anna Keenan, Jordan Pendenault, and Elizabeth May. even though Elizabeth May personally stated that she would not be running for leader of the Green Party anymore, Elizabeth May has decided to run as the Green Party leader again. But the only reason that she's doing it, it seems, is because it seems that here's the plan. Anna Keenan and Chad Walcott, as well as Elizabeth May and Jonathan Pendenult, will be running as co-leaders. Essentially, both of those pairs will be trying to change the Green Party to have a co-leadership model rather than the one-leader model. Honestly, I don't think that's really a valid reason. I think Elizabeth May really should not be leading the Green Party anymore. But to be fair, I guess technically under her leadership, the party membership grew 300%, so hey, I mean, I guess technically it would make sense to have her leader, but I really did legitimately think that Paul Manley should have been the leader of the Green Party. He was the forefront leader of, like, the Green Party successes, so naturally he would probably have the best mindset on how to win elections as a Green. But whatever, it really doesn't matter. The NDP is the more favorable left-wing party in Canada. Speaking of left-wing parties, there's something interesting that's happening in New York District 10. You see, the New York Working Families Party has finally removed Mondaire Jones from their ballot line. This answers two questions. One, Mondaire Jones had their ballot line. Really weird. I don't necessarily understand. The only reason that I think it makes sense is because due to the fact that they endorsed him, they gave him the ballot line, and when he moved districts, he just so happened to keep the ballot line, even though the party changed their mind and endorsed Line-Niou. But here's the thing. The fact that they've removed Mondaire Jones from the ballot line does give an indication. Like, you see, because some of the people were saying, like, during, like, the drama about, like, oh, will Line-Niou run as the candidate? There were some people who were saying that there's a good chance that they might just keep Mondaire Jones on the ballot line, and he just doesn't actively campaign. Basically doing what Joe Crowley did in New York District 14 in 2018. But the fact that that is not the case does give an indication that maybe they're actually planning on running an actual candidacy. There is one more thing that I should talk about in the New York 10th District, and it appears that there was also some drama in regards to Mondaire Jones and the Working Families Party. You see, Mondaire Jones apparently gave an interview where he explained that the reason why he actively stayed in the race was because the Working Families Party was essentially goading him to stay in, and promised that they would not only back him wholeheartedly, and they would push massively to help him win re-election, but they would also try everything in their power to make sure that Line-Niou would not run. Neither of which, of course, ended up happening. Is Mondaire Jones just saving face, or is he true? I don't really know, and personally, that's not really important at the moment. Now, the next story is quite interesting. Something very large that happened. Mary Peltola managed to win in the Alaska special election to become the first Alaskan native in Congress and the first Democrat to hold a statewide office in a heck of a long time. That's, of course, a huge shock for a lot of people. Alaska is a lot more well known for its red-leaning rather than its blue-leaning, obviously. So many people are curious as to why this happened, and many people are saying, like, good things and bad things about it. I remember seeing people like, oh, Mary Sattler Peltola's win shows that Roe v. Wade truly is changing the nation, because many people point out, like, the fact that a lot of the special elections that happened before were basically party line, but most of the special elections that happened after the Roe v. Wade decision were mostly Democrat-leaning, especially those regarding to swing seats. Some people say that Mary Peltola's win is a huge win for pro-gun Democrats, because apparently Peltola is pro-gun, I think. I don't really know what Peltola's political beliefs are. Peltola is basically, like, generic Democrat, sort of. I don't necessarily, like, she's not really, like, she doesn't really strike me as, like, a moderate Democrat. Maybe she is, but let's be fair, like, Alaska is just a weird place politically. Like, in the last Senate election that they had, it was literally Republican, Libertarian, Independent, Democrat. Libertarian got second place in the race, and the Libertarian in that race wasn't even a real Libertarian. He was a conservative, and the Democrat in the race was a former Republican. And not just a former Republican, a former left-wing Republican. But of course, the real reason that this race ended up being how it is because of not only ranked choice voting, but the fact that this race just kind of failed. Like, don't get me wrong, ranked choice voting obviously is good, but the fact of the matter is, this isn't how the race was supposed to pan out. If you may remember, not that long ago, the fourth member of this race dropped out, thus leaving 3 people in the race. So there were only 3 candidates: Palin, Peltola, and Bekich. Palin is of course a conservative, Peltola is a Democrat, so of course they have their bases down. But what about Bekich? Bekich was actually, he's a weird candidate. He's basically sort of a moderate Republican, at least in the veneer, in the same way that you would consider quote unquote Romney as the moderate Republican, or how people consider like Liz Cheney like now a moderate Republican. But maybe you can actually say that Bekich actually has more of that notion, because Bekich actually comes from a large political family within Alaska, and that family is a multi-partisan family. Like the Bekich in this race is Nick Bekich III. Nick Bekich I was a Democratic representative who held the seat before Don Young. So as such, Bekich was basically seen as the moderate candidate in the race, and had some people who would basically be a little bit aligned with Peltola or Palin. And actually, there was a thing that was shown, that was like a graph, and it showed very clearly, it was like a 60-40 thing, where 60% of his voters went to Palin, and 40% of his voters went to Peltola. It just so happened like that was just the slight edge that she needed, because in the second round, all the Democratic voters were now united behind her. However, the upcoming election might not be that problematic, because they have 4 candidates and everything seems to be hunky-dory ready to go. They have 2 Republicans, Bekich and Palin. Peltola is of course in the race. And lastly, there's a Libertarian by the name of Chris By. And I might just have to take a wild guess and say that a lot of Libertarian voters will probably more than likely back Palin, because Palin is still sort of seen as like a Tea Party icon, and the Libertarian Party and the Tea Party basically like overlap a lot. So unless they're going to do it in the same way that Maine District 2 did it in 2018, where they eliminated both losers, I don't think that it's going to necessarily pan out well for Peltola. It might put well for Peltola, but there's also one more factor. What if the people who were Palin-aligned Bekich voters see what happened and just decide that they're going to back Palin in round 1? I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see if Peltola's magic can stick around. With that out of the way, let's move on to the main topic of this video, the Israeli Knesset election. This is one of the last foreign elections that I'm going to be talking about this year. In fact, actually due to a screw up, I'll actually be talking about, I made the promise that a certain election would be the last one. We all know which one it is, but I'm still not going to say it yet because I want to keep the suspense going. But due to a screw up that I should have been paying attention to, I should have done one in the last 2 months, and then I should have done one last month, and then I should have done that last one this month, but I didn't do that, so we're going to get 2 in 1 month. But the thing is, you guys like these videos, so it doesn't matter. You guys like that. And this is a country that, of course, their election is going to be quite the interesting one. And you can take a wild guess as to why. It's Israel. Of course it's going to be a very interesting endeavor. The entirety of the Israeli-Palestine conflict and just the whole history of Israel is just an interesting story. Their political system and, of course, all of the preludes and issues with the regards of the entirety of the Israel issue is going to be quite an interesting thing. And that, of course, plays a very heavy part in the election, especially this specific chapter of the story, because this specific thing comes in a weird history chapter for Israel. You see, this is going to be their 5th snap election in 4 years. If you've paid attention to some of my stories that I've talked about in the Fireside chats before, you'll notice that I've actually talked about these very briefly sometimes. Another reason why is that their election process is actually very interesting. You see, in the Knesset, you need 61 seats out of 120 to have a majority. Now you might say, that's literally just a little over a half. So why is this their 5th snap election? Well, you see, Israel actually has done something interesting to be somewhat democratic. Unlike America, which has two-party or bust, you have a plethora of parties to choose from in Israel, and that's because they have proportional representation, and they are incredibly liberal on how they give you the seats. All you need is 3.25% to get 3 or 4 seats in the Knesset. So if you just so happen to find that particular niche in the population, you can pretty much guarantee 3 or 4 seats forever. And due to this, there have been a lot more opportunities for governments to be part of a coalition. In fact, I think basically every single Israeli government has been a coalition. Now you'd think that that would usually mean that it would basically be impossible for one individual to accrue a lot of power in Israel. But the late 90s basically changed that with the introduction of a man named Benjamin Netanyahu, who basically became the face of a new right-wing populist movement in Israel, his particular brand becoming the forefront force of Israeli politics for 15 years, having a tenure briefly in the late 90s and then more prominently in the late 2000s. And Bibi, as he's been called, has been able to keep his grip on power very tight until the early 2020s, when there was a disagreement over a bill to exempt Haredi Jews from serving in the IDF. For those who don't know, Haredi means ultra-Orthodox. And for added context, in Israel, services in the IDF are mandatory. You have to serve at least 1 year in the IDF to basically just be a citizen in Israel. You see, he was in a coalition called Blue and White to mount a viable Big Tent candidacy against him. And due to that, many people were actually saying, is this the end for Bibi? Is this truly it? Will Benny Gantz be able to take him on? Well, unfortunately, that election led to a tie that was nowhere close to getting an outright majority. So the president of the Israeli Knesset at the time told Benjamin Netanyahu, okay, here's a chance to form a government. Then he failed, and then immediately voted to dissolve the parliament before Benny Gantz even got a chance to try and form a government, thus triggering a new election later that year. The results were not that much different, except there was a slight more effort to coalesce. The Arab parties reformed an alliance called the Joint List, there was a center-left alliance called Labour Geshur, and an alliance of small left-wing parties called the Democratic Union. But then when it was time for them to form coalitions beyond those particular niche groups, there was one stipulation that always had to be met that none of the other groups could provide. To the best of my knowledge, this isn't a real one, but let's just say, like, the Joint List says, like, okay, can you guys, like, stop murdering Palestinians, please? And then the parties would be like, ooh, no. So then they wouldn't be able to form a coalition because they would need that particular group, the Joint List, to form a coalition. As such, election number 4. By this election cycle, almost all of those coalitions and alliances that I mentioned previously, Blue and White coalition, had disbanded. Everybody was just sick and tired of all of these elections, and it seemed like everybody was just willing to just let whoever form a coalition. As such, when it was time, Benjamin Netanyahu won a very large margin, and it was expected that he had a very easy path to winning. But somehow, his parties just weren't able to form the coalition that they needed, because there was one group called Yamina that just wouldn't jump in line with Netanyahu. But the problem was, the opposition was just too factionalized to actually form a governing coalition. And as such, like, they gave them time to form one, but everyone was just like, alright, let's just gear up for election number 5. But somehow, a massive anti-Netanyahu coalition formed, with parties from the center-left, parties from the right, parties from the center, parties that almost, you would never see work together, all of a sudden had announced that they would work together, and somehow this massive anti-Netanyahu coalition emerged. However, it was very volatile. Everybody knew that it would just take one small bill to make the coalition fall apart. And one day, it came when very harsh things in regards to the Palestinian issue were being raised, including, I think it was at the time, the marriage law, where it's like people in Israel can't marry a Palestinian to get them an Israeli citizenship. And after that fell apart, the coalition did, which is why we're having elections now. And now we can finally start talking about the contenders of this election. And this one will be worded slightly differently. You see, since this is proportional representation, technically everybody is a contender. So I do get to talk about all the parties. This is one of those big ones. You can see it in the thumbnail. In retrospect, since this is proportional representation, I probably should have used the party names instead of the candidates, like the PM leaders, but it just makes more of an interesting thumbnail, I guess. So we'll be starting like the party name first, and how many people there are in the party that would give an indication that how powerful this party is, give their broad philosophy, but then also give a special segment of their philosophy talking point to talk about their stance on Zionism, because this is a very important issue for Israeli parties. Like, their particular stance on Zionism can make or break the election. And before you say, wait, what? There are different versions of Zionism? Yeah, there are. Quite a number of different versions of Zionism, to be honest. And then, of course, we'll talk about the leaders. Got it? Good. Let's start with the biggest one, Likud. They are currently at 29 members. They are a right-wing populist and nationalist party. Their stance on Zionism, liberal Zionist party, representing the secular middle class. It used to be the backbone of the blue and white coalition before deciding to go solo. As I mentioned before, their stance on Zionism is liberal Zionism. A Jewish state must be created and maintained, but it is 100%, like, it has to be a liberal democracy. Now, as I stated, their party is sort of represented by the secular middle class. Meanwhile, again, it states that they have to maintain a Jewish state. They are basically the people who would be considered culturally Jewish, but not religiously Jewish. You see, that's also another divide in Israeli politics. There are some people who are like, you can't be a real Jew unless you are religiously Jewish. You can't just be, like, culturally Jewish. Like, Likud is for the people who are, like, I guess, kind of in religion, and these guys are, like, for the more secular Jews. They are led by Yair Lapid, the current prime minister. Yes, Yair Lapid, due to the rules and, like, how the Israeli election went out, he is currently the prime minister of Israel, leading the massive anti-Netanyahu coalition. The next party is the National Unity Party, a party of 14 people. They are a liberal political alliance of Blue and White and New Hope to oppose Netanyahu. New Hope, I didn't mention them previously, they're basically a group of people who used to be members of Likud who broke away because they felt that Benjamin Netanyahu was taking the party in a direction that they couldn't really fit into. And as I mentioned before, they're a liberal party, so of course they would be more liberal Zionists. They are led by Benny Gantz, the 20th Chief of General Staff on the IDF. Now, you might be wondering, wait, I thought Blue and White dissolved. Well, you see, apparently what happened is, and you'll see this a little bit when we talk more about other parties, in Israel, there's sort of like this weird thing where it's like parties within parties within parties. Because Blue and White was not only the massive political alliance that included Yesh Atid, but it was also a political party which included the Israeli Resistance Party, which was what Benny Gantz's official party registration was. It's really weird, but you're not going to be seeing this kind of nesting doll stuff until we get into other parties. The next party is Shas, a 9-member party. It's a Haredi political party that are pretty right-wing on social issues and center-left on economics. They're basically the Christian Democrats of Jewish people. As I said, this is a particularly Haredi party. So much so that the party does not allow women to run, because that would be against their interpretation of the Torah, I guess. Now, you'd think that they would have a more religious interpretation of Zionism, but apparently not. They're apparently just broadly Zionist. They are led by Aryeh Deri, who is the party founder. Apparently, he was supposed to be in... There was apparently like a corruption scandal or something where it was like he wasn't allowed to be the party leader for a little bit, but I guess they just let him continue being party leader. I don't necessarily know why. The next party is United Torah Judaism, or UTJ, a 7-member party. It's an Ashkenazi Jewish party. Basically, your more typical religious conservatives. Like, the thing about Shas was that Shas was like super religious to the point where it's like you could quote unquote tell. Like if I showed you a picture of one of their former leaders, you'd be like, oh, but clearly he's like one of the more religious members of Jewish politics. But UTJ seems to be more of your broad religious conservative. But like I said, like Shas was more of like a Christian democratic thing, but for Jewish people. Meanwhile, this is for your more typical religious conservatives. Their stance on Zionism is Haredi non-Zionism. Now, it's like, what? Now, as I mentioned before, Haredi is a particular branch of Judaism, and non-Zionism means that they are willing to help support the Jewish settlements in Palestine, but will not come on Aliyah. Aliyah is immigration to Israel. I hope that's the thing. I should have prefaced this before I began the video that I'm pretty sure I could be pronouncing a ton of this stuff wrong, but you can tell I'm trying my best. The head of this party is Moshe Gafni, a longtime Knesset member. The next party is Yisrael Bientu. It's a 7-member party, which is a secular right-wing party that represents the interests of immigrants from the USSR. Now, there's apparently a bit of a contention with Yisrael Bientu. You see, because this party is basically the party of Russians, like Russian immigrants to Israel, whether they be from the USSR or from modern-day Russia. However, there's a bit of a problem. You see, because if you're a person who immigrated from the USSR, you're probably going to have a very different reason from leaving the USSR than a person who is leaving Russia today probably has. And that's led to a bit of a contention between the older members of the party and the younger members of the party, because the older members of the party, they are actually very pro-Putin. Meanwhile, younger members of the party are extremely anti-Putin. But anyways, their branch of Zionism is revisionist Zionism, which is the position that Likud used to hold. Revisionist Zionism was basically the idea that Jews have the right to sovereignty over the whole Eretz Yisrael, meaning from Palestine to Transjordan. I remember I watched a video, but it was by Bad Empanada, and he didn't really quite understand all the aspects of it. But basically, from what I understand, it's because the original version of Zionism was literally just what land Israel is, like from the West Bank to the Gaza Strip. That is what they say. Like, that's what's in the books that they're supposed to have, so they get that. But revisionist Zionism, of course, means they believe that they deserve more land. Like, they deserve the whole Holy Land. You see, because that's what I was wondering. I was like, when I first heard the term revisionist Zionism, I would think that it meant less, but text turns out it means more. Yisrael Bientu is led by Avigdor Lieberman, a longtime Knesset member. And now we have the Labor Party. It's another 7-member party, which is a social democratic party formed from the former leading force of Israeli politics. Take a wild guess on basically anything regarding this party. This party is widely regarded as the far-right party in Israel. As the name implies, they are in favor of religious Zionism. Zionism with a heavy focus on Judaism. You know, Israel was given to them by God, and that their government would heavily rely on the Torah to govern how Israel is. They are headed by Bezalel Smotrich, a lawyer and politician who has said wonderful things like, "I'm not willing to recognize Reform conversionism and their fake religion. I am a proud homophobe." This next quote, he's talking about an Arab person. "Either I will shoot him, or I will jail him, or I will expel him. It is natural that my wife would not want to lay down next to someone who just gave birth to a baby who might want to murder her baby in another 20 years. And we, Orthodox Jews, all should want the state of Israel to be run according to the Torah and Jewish law. It's just because It's just that we can't because there are people who think differently from us, and we have to get along with them. Now, if you think that is far right, technically, that's not the furthest right you can be in Israel. That would have to go to one of the members of his coalition, because the Religious Zionist Party is apparently a coalition. You see, as I mentioned before, they're parties within parties within parties. And one member of the coalition, who I am only mentioning because originally he was considered to run a candidate against the Religious Zionist Party because he felt that they were too far left, but he apparently finally able to manage to quell any differences between the two, is one member of the coalition named Itamar Ben-Gvir of the party called Otzma Yehudit, a Kahanist party. Kahanism is literally the furthest right ideology in Israel, believing that they should be a theocracy where non-Jews have no rights. To be blunt, they're essentially Israeli fascism. The man who founded the ideology, Rabbi Meir Kahane, was also the founder of something called the Jewish Defense League, a group that has been connected to the bombing of the offices of the Sal Harak, the murder of an American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee regional director, Alex Ode, the Cave of the Patriarchs massacre, an attempted assassination of Darrell Issa, and 15 terrorist attacks from 1980 to 1985. Yeah. Unsurprisingly, this is a group that has also coalesced with the Likud. The next party is Meretz, a party with 6 members. It's an explicitly secular social democratic party. I at one point considered them the Israeli Green Party. Technically, they were in a coalition with the Israeli Green Party when they were in the Democratic Union. Basically, the only differences between Meretz and Labor is essentially that Meretz is sort of, they're basically considered sort of the Green Party. They're the default from people who are too far left for Labor, but not too far left to join in a extremely fringe party. And it's also because of particular niches that these groups have. Of all of the parties that are explicitly Zionist, this is the one that is the most Palestinian friendly. Remember when I talked about the harsher things previously about what was going on with Palestine? Well, you see, Meretz was one of 2 parties to act, well, I guess one of 3 parties to stand up against it. And again, this is a party that is still Israeli, they're still in the sort of the class of people that greatly benefit from these things. So the fact that they're standing up for it is actually pretty good. They are led by Zahiva Gal'an, a former MK. Them were particular niches of Israeli Arabs, but they all united on this one issue. There are currently 4 members of the Joint List. Mada, which is a non-Zionist party, which has no members. There's Tal, an Arab nationalist party that has 1 member. Balad, a left-wing pan-Arabic party, which has 2 members. And lastly, Hadash, which is basically the Israeli Communist Party, which has 3 members. And it's funny because Hadash is actually a coalition in and of itself of the Israeli Communist Party. Again, the nesting dolls. This party essentially teeters from non-Zionism to anti-Zionism. There are some factions within the party that are anti-Zionist. I think Balad is the only one that's explicitly anti-Zionist. The rest are non-Zionist. The fact that this coalition is happening does give an indication that they are not necessarily in the hegemony of Zionism good. Obviously, even Meretz, that is definitely their main. Zionism inevitably still good, even if you argue that you can fix it in some capacity. They are currently led by Ayman Odeh, a lawyer and politician. Now, in doing research, I actually found out something very interesting. You see, because one of the things that Ben Empanada said in his video about the Israeli thing is that anti-Zionist parties are not allowed, which I clearly just debunked by saying that Balad is very openly anti-Zionist. But the thing is, there was a brief attempt to get Balad expelled from the Knesset. And due to this, Ayman Odeh did actually at one point plan on resigning the Knesset in protest, but he decided to stay around because, if I resign, then one of the largest Israeli Arab voices is gone, so it's better for me to stick around. But you see, the thing about the joint list is that, as you mentioned, broadly it's still left-wing. Like, none of the parties that I mentioned were basically anywhere close to the right. That's because the right wing of the joint list left to go solo, that party being RAM. RAM is a 4-member party, which is an Islamic political party. Basically, it used to be, like I said, formerly the right wing of the joint list, but they left as there were pretty much a lot of divides. One, the very obvious ideological one, joint list is broadly for secular Arabs. Meanwhile, RAM was for the explicitly religious Arabs, Islamic. But there was one other disagreement, and that was over the Israeli-Palestine issue. You see, as I mentioned before, the joint list very heavily open in regards to how they view the Israeli-Palestine issue, but RAM basically ignores the Israeli-Palestine issue. They ignored the Israel-Palestine. Due to the fact that they weren't as hardline on the Israeli-Palestine issue, made it so that they could enter that broad coalition. They are led by Mansour Abbas, a dentist turned politician. The next party is Zionist Spirit. This party was originally much higher. It was a conservative party, not a religious party. They are Zionist, but it's technically more like some of it's religious and some of it's just nationalistic. But again, it's essentially just the right-wingers who felt that Likud was too soft. They are currently led by Ayelet Shaked, the Minister of the Interior, and apparently one of the most prominent Israeli politicians in the world, aside from probably Netanyahu. And the last party is Noam. Noam is a 1-member party. It used to be a member of the Religious Zionist Party, but they refused to run on a list with them. But it's not because they felt that the Religious Zionist Party was too far right. I don't know why, compared Israel to conversion therapy, saying an entire country is going through conversion therapy, it's time to stop it. Talking crap about Reform Judaism, LGBTQ rights, and it ended with 2 parents going into a voting booth and writing on their ballots, "Let my son marry a woman," and "Let my grandson be Jewish." Very heavily in the religious-oriented side of things. Their stance on Zionism is Hardel religious Zionism. It's religious Zionism that takes heavily after Haredi teachings. They are unofficially led by their only MK, Avi Moaz. Now, have an actual shot at actually doing anything. But now we get into the somewhat sad and somewhat possibly uplifting end of things. Polling-wise, it's very obviously a Likud win. At least just based on the party lists alone. Likud seems to be very much heavily veered to win. But the problem is, that's one of the big issues. For Likud, it is very obvious that Likud is just going to be sticking together. But you have to take into consideration that there's going to be potentially a big coalition against Netanyahu. And if you do the arithmetic to determine how the government would be, they would win. But the problem is, they are going by the idea of the current government staying unified, which is very unlikely to happen. Again, they're putting in people like Zionist Spirit with Ram. It's are they really going to stick around? Or was that? We don't know who's going to lead the next government. So, there really isn't much else to say. I really only talked about this election because it was interesting. Joint list, 100%. I'd be back in the joint list. And, Meretz is pretty cool. But otherwise, there's really no other parties that are really even worth talking about. I say after I spent a whole video talking about them. So yeah, anyways, that's pretty much all I gotta say on this subject. This series will return for its last episode of the year on the 26th, where we finish what we started in year 1. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, and Patreon.